It's such a privilege to be with a Nobel laureate, a molecular biologist of distinction from Cambridge, to lead into this discussion. I'm going to tell you about a small incident that happened at home a few days back. I was reading Dr. Venki Ramakrishnan's book, and it was lying on my table. And my 7-year-old granddaughter, she happened to come home and saw it and told my wife, "What is Achachan reading? Why we die? We die because we live," she said. So it sounded very philosophical, and I thought I'm going to ask you that later on, not about in this session. So the issue is, there was time, in a literary festival like this, we evoke poetry and literature where, we have intimations of mortality are a theme. But of late, it looks like there's a counter-intimation of immortality, particularly among Californian billionaires. And to be fair, scientists with excellent credentials, Nobel laureates, who also think that aging is something that can be extended. I don't know if many of them think it can be stopped or reversed. But I would think that in genetics, as probably Venki will tell us, is immortal. Aging is not inevitable, as he says in his book. So, which leads me to the first question. What is it that over the last, let's say, century, our lifespans have doubled? In fact, just last December, 29th of December, Tomika Ituka, Japanese woman, she was the oldest living person, died when she was 116 years old in Japan. About in 2018, before that, we had Kane Tanaka, another Japanese woman, who died when she was 119. Of course, the oldest person we know who's cited in the book is Jean Calment, who is from southern France, who died when she was 122, but that was way back in 1997. So it looks like, although our lifespan is doubled, there's a kind of plateauing off of age in the realm of 120, 125. Is this because, of course, the empirical reasons could be that we have conquered some of these diseases because of antibiotics, because of advances in science, and already we are tackling, I think, even cardiovascular diseases and maybe cancer. It looks like the next set of diseases are diseases that belong to aging, degenerative diseases, perhaps, and Parkinson's and dementia, and cancer continues to be a problem. So there is a shift in terms of even the focus of diseases into the aged community. So do you really think that what the biotech companies, the pharma companies, which are talking about, which are going into aging research and trying to arrest or if not reverse aging, are barking up the wrong tree? Or are they barking up the right tree but making too much noise about it? What's your sense about where we are at in this sense?
So you've asked a rather complicated question with many different aspects. And I'll go through them in sort of turn, if I can remember all of them. One is, you asked about lifespan and whether it can be extended. And to understand that, you have to ask how our lifespan came to be what it is. And you mentioned that life expectancies increased dramatically in the last 150 years, but most of that was done by solving problems at the early end of life, that is, infant mortality, early childhood diseases, diseases of youth, and so on. And so that was done largely by public health, secondarily by things like public health, meaning sanitation, clean water, things like that. Then secondarily by vaccines, and thirdly by the advent of antibiotics and medicine. There's also some gain at the other end. Oh, and by the way, I should really mention nutrition. For much of our lives, most of us were malnourished, and food security, getting enough food to eat was a big problem. And that was also gradually solved, at least in many parts of the world. But the extension at the later end of life was due to progress in things like heart disease, cancer, diabetes. We've not made so much progress with dementia, but at least those other three we've made significant progress. And that's extended our average life expectancy from sort of, say, 60s to now in developed countries to the mid-80s. But what that hasn't done is, as you pointed out, changed the limits of our ability to live, which is sort of around 15 to 120, and you gave a number of examples. That hasn't changed, and the reason for that limit is because evolution has selected that our biology to have that sort of lifespan. Now, how does evolution operate? Well, evolution doesn't care how long you live. It cares about something called fitness, which is your ability to mature and pass on your genes, your likelihood of passing on your genes. So if you look at longevity of species, what you'll find is that on average, small animals like rats or mice have a very short lifespan, and large animals have a relatively long lifespan. There's a correlation. And animals like the Greenland shark or the bowhead whale can live for several hundred years. Why is this? Even though we're all made of the same material, we're all made of nucleic acid and proteins and lipids, carbohydrates, and so on. The reason is that in the evolution of a species, there has to be a selection for fitness, and that means that there's always a decision being made about allocation of resources. So historically, resources were limiting, namely food, and which is converted to energy, etc. And so what is the balance between spending those resources on maintenance and repair of the organism to keep it alive longer versus rapid growth and maturation and producing lots of offspring? Well, if you're a mouse, there's no point in spending a lot of resources keeping a mouse alive for 40 or 50 years, because long before that, the mouse will be eaten by a predator or die of starvation or some external cause, like drought or a flood. And so evolution has selected for traits where a mouse matures rapidly and produces lots of offspring before that happens. And so it doesn't, and those selection mechanisms that allow it to do that also contribute to aging later in life, but that's not selected against because it's passed on its genes. And on the other hand, if you're a large animal, your metabolism is slow, it takes you longer to mature, you have to find a mate, your gestation period and period of childhood and adolescence is also longer. And so for them, nature has selected a much longer lifespan. So the question that you ask is that lifespan fixed? Well, the answer is there's no physical or chemical law that says this has to be your lifespan. It's simply our natural biology has been selected so things start to break down and we age at that rate and start to break down. And so it's very unlikely that any of us is going to live beyond 120. I think Jean Calment, at least so far, was an outlier. But it doesn't mean that we can't change it by interfering with the causes of aging. But having said that, that's very difficult. It's not something that's around the corner. Although many of these companies and the more enthusiastic members of the aging research community would have you believe it's going to happen anytime now, I don't think it's going to happen very soon because aging is highly complex and multifactorial. And the idea that you can suddenly turn on a switch that will slow it down isn't going to happen right away. But I think as we learn more about the biology, as the tools become more powerful, I wouldn't rule it out sometime in the future. But you have to remember, there's no physical law saying you can't colonize Mars. Okay, but it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow.
Although Musk thinks he's going to colonize Mars.
Yes, Musk thinks a lot of things. He said that he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And he also is, I think, a believer in cryonics, which is this idea of freezing your body and have it resurrected at some point in the future, which I think is bonkers. But anyway, I joke in the book that maybe when he goes to Mars, one of the first things he'll do is open up a cryonics facility there.
In your book, it covers fantastic ground. It's a vast span that you cover. And you look at some of the attempts that are going on in laboratories, in biotech labs, and in pharma companies, perhaps in research labs. If I can just point to some of them so that you can explain the science perhaps as quickly as possible, and also talk about the feasibility of each of these relatively. Yeah. One is cellular reprogramming. That seems to be what?
Sorry?
Cellular reprogramming. The Yamanaka factor and Belmonte.
Yeah. No,
and so
I know you're familiar with Belmonte for personal reasons, and that's what you're talking about is the ability to make cells go backwards in development. So in the normal course of development, what happens is a fertilized egg is a single cell. It starts to multiply or divide, however you call it, to form early embryonic cells. Each of these early embryonic cells has the ability to form any kind of tissue, whether it's skin or neurons or muscle, any of those tissues. But as development progresses, even these cells specialize. So these cells are called stem cells because they can regenerate and they can differentiate into more developed cells. But they specialize, so certain kinds of stem cells can only form cells of the blood system. These are called hematopoietic stem cells. There are other cells that can only form cells of the nervous system, the brain and the central nervous system. Now, the system doesn't normally go in reverse. And so what happens is that people have found that if you treat cells in a certain way by turning on very few transcription factors, for example, 4 factors that affect which genes are turned on, you can make the cell go backwards in development. In fact, you can take a fully differentiated tissue like skin or muscle or a cell of the immune system and simply make it go all the way back to an early embryonic cell. So similar to that. Those are called induced pluripotent stem cells. They're now a big area of research because people want to be able to regenerate tissue that's been damaged, for example, pancreatic tissue or heart muscle and so on. Now, the reason they're excited about this in aging is that we're constantly regenerating our cells all the time. For example, if you get a cut, then your skin heals and it grows over, and that's because you're making new skin cells. Similarly, your immune system is constantly regenerating cells, it's producing new cells that make new kinds of antibodies and so on. But as we age, we lose that ability to regenerate tissue because the stem cells themselves start to age and decline in number and quality. And so if you were able to reprogram cells to make them go somewhat backwards in development, then you might be able to recover this ability to regenerate tissue and thereby improve health and aging. And I wouldn't have thought it was a very likely scenario, but experiments in animals have shown some remarkable results where when they transiently turned on these factors to move these cells backwards in development, the animals then started to resemble, by various criteria, started to resemble much younger animals. So there's a lot of excitement in the field. Having said that, this is quite a dangerous and tricky area because you can also induce cancer by reversing development and creating stem cells, because you're creating cells with the ability to proliferate. The idea is how much to do it and how to target tissues, how to do this uniformly in a safe way is a big question. So although I would say this is a very promising area in the future, I think it's still at the stage of really fundamental research that will hopefully tell us what the prospects are.
You did say that reversal has a risk of cancer, particularly all the way if you want to go to the pluripotent cell. But now they're talking about partial reversal, right?
Yes,
like
the
Belmonte
trouble
and
with
so on.
partial reversing is it's a distribution. You know, you're giving a Yamanaka factor transiently. First of all, how to deliver these factors, in mice, they do it by creating transgenic mice, for example. But you're not going to do that with humans. And secondly, the other way to do this is by giving adenoviral or some viral vectors that contain the genes for these factors under some control. That sort of technology hasn't quite been,
Right.
you know, it's not ready for clinical use in humans yet. So you said transiently. The point is you do it transiently, and most of the cells will only go back a short way, but that doesn't mean a few cells won't go all the way back.
Right.
You know, so there is a distribution, and that's a problem.
Right. Apart from the cell reprogramming, like the Yamanaka factors, as you mentioned, there are some others. I'll just mention them, and I'd like your view on which of these would you place your bets on, if at all, on any of them, right?
Yeah.
Like, for instance, there are drugs which are supposed to simulate or mimic calorie restriction,
Yeah.
which is a good bet. DNA repair, epigenetics. Which of these areas is promising, if at all?
So DNA repair, well, epigenetics is related to the Yamanaka factors, because what they do, epigenetics is basically where your DNA is modified so that it changes which genes are repressed at any given time. And as we get older, we change our DNA so that this program of gene expression changes. And what the Yamanaka factors partly do is they change those patterns to make the cell resemble an earlier stage of development. So we've already discussed that. DNA repair by itself has not been, I think, a particular target for aging. It's much more a target for cancer therapy. Now, you mentioned a couple of other things, so maybe I should go through a list. So one of them is, one of the exciting things, or certainly what the community is excited about, is caloric restriction. It's been known for quite a while that if you restrict dramatically the number of calories consumed, then the animal tends to resemble a younger animal. It increases its lifespan modestly, but it seems to be somewhat healthier. And of course, there's a caveat to these experiments, because the control group of animals is usually fed an extremely rich ad libitum diet, which is an all-you-can-eat diet of very rich food. And that's not very natural. I mean, it's become natural for us humans, and which is why we have this rise in obesity and diabetes and so on. But it wasn't natural for most of our existence. But nevertheless, it does mean that if you reduce calories, it has some beneficial effects, up to a point, obviously, above the level of starvation. So it turns out calorie restriction turns on several metabolic pathways in the cell. And one of the things that has happened in the last few decades is we're able to talk about exactly what those pathways are. We don't know, perhaps we don't know all of the pathways that caloric restriction turns on, but we know some of the major pathways. And it also turns out that if you have drugs that inhibit some of those pathways, they show many of the effects of caloric restriction. So one such pathway I describe in the book is called the TOR pathway, which is responsible for growth and turning on protein production. And if you inhibit the TOR pathway, which is also inhibited if you restrict the number of calories, but you can do it with a drug like rapamycin, then you also mimic many of the effects of caloric restriction. The mice tend to be somewhat healthier, and they tend to live a little bit longer. My remembrance is it's about 30%. So the question is, should we all be taking rapamycin? Well, you have to remember that if you turn down protein synthesis, you're also affecting all sorts of other things. For example, you're going to affect the immune system. And not surprisingly, rapamycin is an immunosuppressive drug. It's been actually FDA approved for people like organ transplant recipients to prevent graft rejection. Now, that's okay. If you are an organ transplant recipient, you absolutely don't want to reject that graft, so you will take rapamycin, even though it makes you more prone to infection. But if you're a healthy individual, for you to take rapamycin for 10 or 20 years is a completely different proposition. So again, although it's promising, you can see that in terms of implementation on a population level, it's not clear. But this hasn't prevented lots of scientists who work on rapamycin from quietly taking it themselves. I don't know where they get their prescriptions, but anyway, they seem to be so enthused by the data, and they don't want to wait around until they are old, so they sort of have jumped the gun. And this shows that scientists are very rational and believe in randomized trials, et cetera, when it comes to somebody else. But when it comes to themselves, they're no more rational than anybody else. So that's one example. Another example is, one class of drugs that could be related to caloric restriction, which is an omission in my book, because when I was writing that chapter, it hadn't quite hit the general consciousness yet. But these are these glucagon-like peptides, these
GLP drugs.
GL2 agonists, and like Ozempic, for example. And these drugs were given primarily for weight loss, and especially in connection with severe obesity and diabetes. But it turns out they're having all sorts of other beneficial effects. For example, they're reducing systemic inflammation. They have, they have lots of effects connected with aging. So there is a talk that maybe these GLP-1 agonists, certain classes of them might be in the future useful as an anti-aging therapy. Mm-hmm. But that belongs to the same class, I would say, as these caloric restriction drugs. A second one is that as we get older, we lose our ability to make important biochemicals in our cells declines. These are typically related to vitamins. We often synthesize them from vitamins. And they're cofactors, that is, they work together with protein enzymes to carry out very important biological reactions. And our ability to make those declines, the level of those declines. And the question is, should we be supplementing with these compounds? And this has a long history, but one of the more recent ones, which is in all the rage, are these compounds which are precursors of an important molecule called NAD, which stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. But NAD precursors like NMN and NR have been shown in mice to restore the levels of NAD to levels of younger mice. And mice treated with these precursors tend to seem healthier. They have slower loss of stem cells or muscle tissue, although their lifespan hasn't increased much. But maybe that's what you want. You want to live healthier but not longer. And so, again, this would require clinical trials, but that takes time. But it hasn't stopped people who work on this to take it themselves. I know of 2 Nobel laureates who are popping these NAD precursors themselves. But anyway, that just shows that they're no more rational than anybody else. And the sales of these compounds is many hundreds of millions today, and it's supposed to exceed $1 billion in a few years. So that's another class. A third class is particularly interesting. It has to do with the fact that when you connect an old animal with a young animal, you basically almost staple them together and you connect their blood supplies so that the blood goes from the young animal into the old animal and then comes all the way back to itself, okay? This is called parabiosis. And when animals, I don't know how people thought of such a bizarre experiment, but anyway, when they did this, they found that the old animal benefited from the young blood, and the young animal suffered as a result of the old blood. So this has led to a search for factors that change in blood over the course of time. Maybe some of these factors stimulate stem cells, maybe they are involved in repair, maybe they're involved in changes in methylation. We simply don't know what all these factors do, and that's a big area of research. But what has happened is, right from the time when these people at Stanford published one of these early findings, all sorts of companies sprouted up which would take blood from young donors and then sell them to rich billionaires at, I forget whether it was $800 or $8,000 a pint, but you get the idea. And this is all without any clinical trials. And FDA tried to close one of them down, and it simply opened up under a new name. And then the CEO said, well, the problem is our clients don't want to wait for clinical trials. They want it now. So that's the problem with a lot of aging research. So you can see there are many aspects. And one important thing I should mention is that as we get older, we accumulate cells called senescent cells. These are cells, when cells undergo stress or DNA damage or infection, often what the cell will do is it will flip it into a state where it's no longer functional and it cannot divide. And this probably evolved as an anti-cancer mechanism, because if you have DNA damage, you don't want that cell to hang around in case it becomes a cancer risk. And so these cells are senescent cells, and they secrete inflammatory compounds, and that too had a biological purpose. The purpose was to attract the immune system cells to the site, to clear the cell and also repair any damage at the site of the infection. Now, as we get older, we start accumulating senescent cells at a greater rate. At the same time, our immune system is also declining, and its abilities to clear senescence also declines. And the result is we have an excess of senescent cells and an excess of systemic inflammation, which in turn causes more problems, which leads to more senescent cells. So you can see that there's a clear relationship between the senescent cells and symptoms of aging. And what scientists have found is if you can specifically kill off senescent cells, then animals tend to again improve. Their symptoms of aging are lower. And then again, there's a problem of how do you deliver senescent cells specifically and not kill other cells, and also how do you make sure those drugs don't have toxic side effects and so on. So there's a lot of promising areas, and I've named a few of them, but it'll take quite a bit of work before they're established as safe and efficacious, before they can be used for humans.
You've given a fair indicative idea of the kinds of attempts on, and I must say you've been very even-handed in the book. If you've read the book, he's given each of these, he may be cynical about it, but explained it. The explanatory science in this book is fantastic and accessible at the same time without making it simplistic. Just two areas I want to touch on. One is this whole business of the gene being immortal and the gene having a mission, which is, as you said at the outset, to propagate to species. Now, obviously, I mean, this is a very lay question. It looks like it hasn't really succeeded well in that, because if you're talking about aging populations increasing, the demographic of aging population seemed to be increasing worryingly in some places, so much so that even in a place like China, where once if you had more children, it was punished. Now they're incentivizing more children. And you see similar responses across the world. So there's something going awry. Is it therefore possible that the gene, at some point, I think you say, can also adjust to these situations on the necessities on the fly? Is it likely that the older age groups might be prioritized and you might find a big change in that sense? This is just a logical question.
No. Well, the first thing is that evolution doesn't select for aging. Aging is simply a byproduct of selecting for traits that help us reproduce and pass on our genes. And so evolution is simply selecting which genes survive, because if genes don't survive, then those offspring are not selected for. So there's no selection for aging.
For fecundity, for procreation?
So it's selecting simply for propagation of genes.
Yeah.
In other words, if the genes don't survive, they can't be selected again for. So it's simply selecting for survival of the genes. And so aging happens to be simply a byproduct, and we don't like it because we, as conscious individuals, don't want to stop existing. Even though we have children, the children are not us, and we want to continue to exist. So we don't like it, but that's actually a side effect of the fact that we have a brain and consciousness. In terms of what will happen with an aging population, well, evolution doesn't act on that sort of time scale.
Yeah.
So really, what will happen long before any evolutionary consequences is we will have social consequences. So if you have everybody living to a very ripe old age and only being very slowly replaced, that will create a different kind of society. You could just imagine, luckily in the US they have a constitutional amendment, but if they didn't, well, like in Russia, obviously they don't, and in China they abolished the requirement. You can imagine a world where 100 years from now you could have Putin and Xi Jinping and Trump all still continuing to govern, without any any changeover. So you can see that what will happen is you'll have very slow turnover of generations, turnover of ideas, and in my opinion, you will have a more stagnant society.
Right. In the book, I think you mildly lament, or if you're cynical about the fact that some brilliant scientists are abandoning their professorships, their research work in the academic field.
I don't blame them, by the way.
Yeah, I know. But they're moving on to the biotech companies or pharmaceutical companies where they continue to do the work. But it's just a devil's advocacy question. Isn't what they're doing actually trying to walk the talk, in the sense that trying to actually prove that you can demonstrate or fail to do so, the aspects of aging that they're working on, and in order to do that, they need to be relieved from writing papers or grants or lectures and so on. That's
actually a good point. So one of the big players in this field is a company called Altos Labs, which was founded by a group of tech billionaires, or rather funded by a group of tech billionaires like Yuri Milner and Jeff Bezos and others. And what they did was they offered...
Rick Klausner said the idea is to live long and die young.
I would like to come to that point in a second. But they attracted a huge number of very prominent aging researchers from top universities. And the way they did that was they said, look, we'll give you a huge salary by academic standards and lots of resources, and you don't have to write for grants, you can just focus on your work. Now, of course, these are tech billionaires. They're used to a short time scale. In digital tech, things work in months or a year, and then you're off to the races. But it's not going to be that way in experimental biology, and I think they're underestimating the time scale that it'll take for these things to actually be of clinical benefit. But the professors feel, well, okay, even if we get 5 or 10 years of, well-funded research, that's fine. At the end, they could just go back to their university, or many of them could just retire, So I don't blame them. And as far as Rick Klausner, when he opened the Cambridge branch of Altos, at which I was, he said, our goal is not for people to live longer, but we want everybody to die young after a long time. And what this means is he wants you to stay young and then suddenly keel over and die. Well, my point is, if you're young, everything's working, why would you suddenly die? This idea of compressing the period of morbidity, this is called compression of morbidity. So you're compressing the years of poor health into a very short period. So you live extremely healthy, and then you suddenly decline and die. That compression of morbidity has never been established in a general population. The only group that seems to have it are people who live over 110. Those people do live extremely healthy lives and suddenly decline and die, which means that they're probably hitting the limits of our lifespan. But for most people, when lifespan has increased, it's also increased the period of morbidity. And in fact, that's why in most societies, the population in nursing homes and care homes has exploded over the last couple of decades, because people are living very long but need assistance, need help. So I'm not sure that compression of morbidity is actually possible. It may be possible, but it's certainly not an established fact.
Right. I think with that, it opens up for questions. Yeah.
10-minute Q&A. Yes, Shweta? You can just ask the question.
I'm afraid you'll have to use the mic, because I'm hard of hearing, hard of old age.
Yes, Ram. After that.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. You mentioned this briefly during your talk today and also in your book, that the underlying factor for this race to aging and long life or living forever is the fact that humans fear dying. And you outline plan A, B, C, D. Are there scientific companies or corporates who are actually addressing that problem, which is to help us overcome the fear of dying?
I don't think that that's realistic, because we have feared death as long as we've been existing as a species that's aware of death. In fact, if you look at ancient Egyptians or the Chinese Emperor Qin, who unified China, all of them were terribly afraid of death, and they went to great lengths to deny death. And even today, there's an old joke which says, who would want to live to be 100? And the answer is somebody who's 99. And the fact is, I don't know, most people here over 60 or certainly over 70 are on some kind of anti-aging, anti-death medication anyway. For example, high blood pressure pills or statins. I'm on those myself. Why do I take them? Because I don't want to die prematurely. And if somebody were to come to you with a pill and said, look, this is going to give you 10 years of extra healthy life. Nobody wants to live unhealthy 10 years. But if you say, I'll give you 10 years of extra healthy life, most of us would take it. So I'm not sure that's a realistic proposition. People may philosophize, but they're thinking of death as something in the distant future. If it's imminent, they don't really want to die.
Venki, as a scientist, how do you visualize evolution? It's a set of iron laws. Does it know what it's doing?
Evolution is completely blind. There is no purpose to evolution. It's simply a selection process. So if you have species and some of them are more successful, they will have more offspring. And so the next generation will be dominated by those offspring. And if genes contributed to their success, those genes will survive. So it's simply a selection mechanism for survivors. There is no purpose to evolution.
Fantasize as God.
No, I think it's almost the opposite, because God implies a design and a purpose. And in fact, you could say, Richard Dawkins has who's written a lot of books on evolution, has a brilliant title called The Blind Watchmaker. And in that sense, evolution is really blind.
May I ask one question? Whether intermittent fasting and endurance sports have a positive impact on the longevity genes by turning on the mTOR or...
There are a lot of intermittent fasting. There are a number of papers which suggest that intermittent fasting actually improves health more than just fasting alone or reducing the number of calories alone. But there are other studies which suggest that the reason intermittent fasting works is it indirectly makes you consume fewer calories. So I think it's not completely clear yet whether intermittent fasting works because it's intermittent or because it results in a more moderate consumption of calories.
Hello, sir. It was a really interesting talk. Thank you for the information. I just had a doubt regarding what you mentioned about stem cell research and new developments to counter aging or to help people live longer. Is it true that there is still a lot of work to be done in actually delivering these treatments, especially to people who might have clinical issues? Like, if I'm not mistaken, there is still no clear technique for even delivering neural stem cells to patients who may require it.
Yeah, so sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Yes, there are still techniques to be developed on how to deliver these treatments to people who might require them, I mean directly, like new drug delivery systems to be developed.
I mean, is your question that we have to figure out techniques, or are you asking how likely is it?
Yes, it is.
Well,
still being...
I think it'll be likely, but you mentioned neural stem cells, and regeneration of brain tissue is going to be one of the hardest problems to tackle, partly our ability to get things into the brain and even understanding really what are the key triggers for some of these dementias and also what are the ultimate causes of death of these neurons is a somewhat debated topic, although there's a lot of evidence that it involves these protein tangles. But getting things into the brain and attacking dementia is one of the more difficult problems with aging.
Hello, Professor. Here in the back. So we already know that gut microbiome plays an important role in developmental disorders, and it also governs our immune system and the brain. So do you think it also plays a fact in aging? That's my first question. And the second question is, evolution is not directed, as you rightly said, and the whole purpose of a species is to pass on the genes to the next generation. So in that sense, all this research related to aging and extending our lifespan, isn't it futile? Because evolution doesn't care about how long we live.
Yes. So, sorry, what is the question?
The first question was related to, do you think aging in humans is also related to our gut microbiome? Because it's already implicated in a lot of our other functions.
Oh, to our microbiome?
Yes, yes.
There are a number of studies which suggest that the composition of our microbiome changes with age and that it may have implications for aging. There are a number of studies which suggest that the microbiome affects the level of inflammation in our system, and that may be another cause of aging. So there is a lot of work being done. It's not an area I discuss a lot in the book, although I just mention it briefly. But it is a growing area of research.
Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. It's sort of strange that we're the only species that has an awareness of our death, of our mortality. There are animals like dolphins and others that could potentially have evolved to have the same awareness. As a scientist speculating, why do you think we are the only species? How did that come about?
So it's a very good question. I don't want to be too dogmatic about other species, but I want to say there's no evidence that other species are aware of mortality. They're aware of death, but they're not aware of mortality, having a lifespan and an expiration date. And that may be because we evolved two things, a very high level of consciousness and self-awareness, and we also evolved communication. And so we learn that we're mortal presumably from our parents and older siblings and so on. It must be a shock when we first learn about it. And the other thing I want to point out is this mortality is a peculiar feeling that's related to our consciousness and self-awareness as an individual, because cells in you are dying all the time, millions of cells. In fact, cells have to die during development. And we're not even aware of that. You know, right when we were speaking, probably millions of cells have been dying. We're not aware of that. And the paradox is that at the moment of death, most cells in your body are still alive. You can donate your organs to somebody and they'll continue ticking away in somebody else. So what do we mean when we die? It means that some critical system has failed, so we can no longer function as a conscious individual. That's what we mean by death. It's a particular kind of death that we're talking about. And that comes from our awareness, our self-awareness.
One question.
one last question.
One question. Here, Balgani. What is the impact of lifestyle on aging? What is the impact of lifestyle on learning?
On aging.
On aging.
Lifestyle on aging. Yeah, so I do point out that all of the biology points out that certain very old advice actually will help you. So for example, the combination of eating moderately, exercising regularly, and getting enough sleep, that trio is actually currently better than any medicine on the market. Now, of course, today we actually know the biological reasons why they work. We know some of the things sleep does and what exercise does and what moderate diet, which is related to caloric restriction, does. So those three things can help you. In addition, there's circumstantial evidence suggesting that loneliness and isolation increases mortality in old age. There's also evidence that having a sense of purpose actually reduces mortality. So the idea is if you retire, maybe you shouldn't isolate yourself and keep watching Netflix, but rather, you know, have a community, socialize, and do something, you know, that has a sense of purpose, maybe in the community or, you know, something beyond yourself. And those are all things, we don't quite understand how that's related to our physiology, but there are definitely, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence for that.
Thank you, Mr. Ramakrishnan and Mr. Sashi Kumar, for a very deep and deliberate discussion on aging and longevity.